Often people ask, if you're right, why is it that so many people disagree with you? Looks like the whole world is against you. So how can that be if you're really right? And sometimes the challenge is put this way: what would you say to them? How would you convince them that you're correct? Why haven't you convinced them that you're correct? I think that there are two matters of principle here, and it's important to get straight about them, and then we'll take some examples. First of all, I don't think your ability to convince someone is important. I don't think it's important. I don't think it's an interesting subject. People will agree with you or disagree with you often for psychological reasons. People won't admit to the most obvious arguments. People often take their positions irrationally. I hope that doesn't sound too strange and too unfamiliar. Surely you know the people who criticize you are often irrational. So there's certainly a lot of irrational people in the world. Why should I measure my position by whether I can convince them to agree with me? Why should I care about that? Let's take an extreme position. Suppose somebody said, 2 + 2 is 5. What would you say to him? How would you convince him that he's wrong? I think the right response is to say, have a nice day, and leave him alone. Suppose somebody said, there are no tables, period. What would you say to him? He said, we're surrounded by tables. Everybody knows there are tables. If he says there are no tables, there's probably no way to reach him. There's probably no way to reach him. Now let me give you a brutal example. What are there more of in the world, Jews or anti-Semites? Is that a hard question? I hope not. There are at least hundreds of millions of rabid anti-Semites. And there are, at last count, something like 12 million Jews. Does that disturb you? Does that sort of worry you? There are hundreds of millions of people who think we're evil. How can I sleep at night? Tell you, I sleep fine. I have no difficulty sleeping at night. What would I say to them to convince them that I'm correct? Nothing. I don't think anything would convince them that I'm correct. Whether I can convince them or not is not an appropriate criterion. My recommendation is don't ever get trapped into, well, how would you show them that you're right? Maybe I can't show them. So what? My motto is, don't count people, count reasons. Count reasons. 1 billion people with one reason counts for one. One person with 3 reasons counts for 3. Don't count people, count reasons. You say there are lots and lots of people who disagree with me? Okay, let's hear their reasons. If there are lots and lots of them, probably they thought up lots and lots of good reasons, right? So let's hear them, and we'll deal with them one by one. By the way, with all the discussion about Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, and the challenge has been quite widely expressed. If it isn't Islam, why don't Islamic institutions condemn it? There's one article where there was people send in their comments, and one person said there's a website, an entry on Wikipedia, which is a list of all the Islamic institutions that have condemned this kind of terrorism. And he gives a list of 8. Okay, there are 1.5 billion Muslims. 1.5 billion. And there are 8 registered condemnations of terrorism. I think that's pretty thin. I think it's pretty thin. None of them are heads of countries. They're institutions, private institutions. If that's all you can say for 1.5 billion people, that's pretty thin. if there are all these people who disagree with us on any subject, even anti-Semites, I'm interested in hearing their reasons. If they present reasons that I can't answer, then I've got some work to do. But if they don't present reasons, and the challenge is, how are you going to convince me you're right? I reject the challenge. I don't have to convince anybody that I'm right. All I have to do is present reasons that I'm right and see whether they can do anything about my reasons, undercut my reasons, or present countervailing reasons. And then if we have a discussion of reasons for and reasons against, then we can try to accomplish something. If I'm presenting reasons they're not bothering, then they don't count. Now, that's the first fundamental idea. And the second fundamental idea is this. We preach paying attention to experts. For us, that's a very important idea. It's a very important principle, paying attention to experts. Now, you have to ask yourself, however, when you're asking about a particular subject, who is the relevant expert for that subject? That shouldn't be a hard question. If it's mathematics, you get a mathematician. If it's physics, you get physicists. If it's violin, you get people who either play the violin very well or people who study the violin and understand it very well. Shouldn't be a difficult question, but it is. Because very often people are tempted to speak using their reputation for expertise in subject A. They're tempted to speak about subject B. And the fact that they aren't experts in subject B seems not to faze people. It seems not to interest people. I taught at Johns Hopkins 100 years ago, in the 70s. We had a physicist there who made his reputation because he discovered a particle, which in those days was a big deal. And the student newspaper interviewed for him for his views on religion. Someone put it up on the philosophy bulletin board with a caption, "See how many mistakes you can find in this." It was childish. It was childish. We wouldn't have passed it as an undergraduate paper. Why did they ask a physicist for views about religion? Because physicists are super smart and super rational and super self-critical, although which isn't true, but even if it were true, but they're very super smart about physics. It's quite possible to be super smart about physics and a dope about religion. Why would you ask him about something in which he's not expert? Where it gets tricky for philosophers is where you ask a physicist about philosophy of physics, philosophy of science. There, maybe there's a sort of natural expectation. If the guy's involved in a field, he ought to understand the fundamentals of it, the basics of it, the justification of it, but that's simply not true. It's not true in any field. Lawyers haven't got a clue about philosophy of law. Writers haven't got a clue about philosophy of language. Philosophy of is a different field from the field itself. Scientists typically are not trained in philosophy of science, and they make the most naive, uninformed, silly remarks about philosophy of science, including Stephen Hawking, who's proud of the fact that he is an adherent of a philosophy that died 50 years ago. He's just not aware of it. He's proud of identifying himself as a positivist. When I taught at Hopkins, two of my colleagues put out a volume called The Legacy of Logical Positivism. A legacy is what a dead man leaves over when he's dead. And here's Hawkins, 60 years later, proud of belonging to that dead group. So when you're talking about respect for expertise, it's crucial to understand, to ask yourself, when you're talking about a subject, who is a relevant expert? Okay, so now you have physics, and you have history, and so forth and so on. Even within an expertise, there can be great controversy. There could be disagreements among the experts. A fellow named Lawrence Krauss, who works in cosmology, is famous for writing a book about how you get something from nothing. And this is his subject. Well, David Albert, who has a PhD in physics and then moved to philosophy of science. So he knows, and he's published in research physics, and he's also a leader in philosophy of science, reviewed the book and simply panned it. The guy is just nuts. Because although it isn't the equations of cosmology, he's using the thing, and he makes just obvious mistakes. Okay, now let's say you don't trust me. You don't think that Albert is better than Krauss, but he's at least as good. Krauss says he's got an answer, and Albert says he doesn't get to first base. He's just out of it. Okay, so then when you've identified the correct expert, then you have to ask, is there a consensus of the experts? Do they disagree with one another? How do they disagree? What reasons do they give? All right, so now let's bring this down to our case. We're talking about the challenges that people make to traditional Judaism, the challenges that are very popular, very widely agreed upon and held. Who would be the relevant expert to assess challenges like that, so we could try to determine whether there are reasons for or against? The answer is, to do this in the best possible way, you need dual expertise. Let's say that there are scientific challenges to Judaism. Being an expert scientist won't be good enough because these are scientific challenges to Judaism. Being an expert in Judaism won't be enough because these are scientific challenges to Judaism. What you really need is a person who has dual expertise, who understands science, knows it well, and someone who knows Judaism well. That's not so easy to find. It's not so easy to find. You have people who have some acquaintance with both fields and have some competence in both fields, but usually one is stronger than the other, and you have to look for the best that you can get. Take myself as an example. I'm trained in philosophy of mathematics. Mathematics is not far from philosophy of science, and I've done a lot of reading in philosophy of science. As a philosopher, I carry my own expertise. I can speak on my own. What about science? Well, I understand externally a great deal of science. When I make statements about science, I quote scientists. I don't say it on my own. If I said it on my own, then a person would have every right to be suspicious. It's not your expertise. But if I quote Steven Weinberg, if I quote Stephen Jay Gould, if I quote Richard Feynman, so then I'm quoting the world's greatest physicists or biologists. So at that point, since I'm leaning on their expertise, I don't think there's any problem. So at that point, you look for people who straddle the line as best they can. Some people have gotten into serious trouble by not obeying this simple idea. These are scientists and philosophers who don't know anything about religion and who shoot off their mouths about religion and how their position is better than the religious position when they don't have a clue how it works. And then their critique simply isn't relevant because they don't have reason on their side. I'm going to give you a few examples, and then if you have objections that are very commonly raised to Judaism and they disturb you, trouble you, we can talk about them. It's the Orthodox view that the world is 5,755 years in existence. And the Orthodox scientific picture is 13.8 billion years. Now, one way to look at it from the religious point of view is that God set it up to look older, even though it isn't. To this, a famous and really very competent, one of the leading philosophers of science, Elliot Sober, particularly works in philosophy of biology, philosophy of evolution, writes, but then if God made it look one way and it's really another way, then he's joking with us. He's just deceiving us, pulling the wool over our eyes. Am I supposed to believe in a jokester God? Now, first of all, when he makes that remark, his scientific training is not behind him. Nothing in his philosophy of biology tells him what kind of God to believe in and what kind of God not to believe in. He's just offering that the way a 6-year-old would offer it. Worse than that, as Rabbi Meisel points out, if you're going to talk about the character of God and how he relates to us, you have to take the whole religious picture. The whole religious picture includes the fact that he told us how old the universe is. He told us. How could you construe that as a joke, as a deception, if he makes it look older, but he tells us that's only an appearance, but the truth is different? Then how could he be deceiving you when he tells you the truth? It just doesn't get off the ground. He is a person who trades on his reputation as being a philosopher, in particular a philosopher of science, but when he has to contrast his position with religion and try to show the weaknesses of religion, has to make a remark about religion. And the remark about religion is just foolish, because he hasn't got dual expertise. Let's say Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins wrote a book against religion, and he has in it what he calls his master argument. The master argument. This is an argument which covers the whole ground. And it goes like this. There are complex things in the world. Things that look designed. This he said in his earliest books, and he's carried it all the way through, and people take it from him. The business of evolution is to explain the appearance of design. The appearance of design. Things do look designed, but their claim is they can explain how they exist without them really being designed. Fine, that's the ballgame. Now he says, appearance of design usually involves complexity. Things that are very simple don't look designed. Only things that have certain complexity, interlocking, cooperative kind of complexity, look designed. He says, but look, how are you going to explain design? By invoking a designer? You're going to say the appearance of design is produced by a designer? But then the designer will have to be at least as complex as the thing you're trying to explain. The designer would have to have, I mean, he doesn't say all of this, he just says that as if it were obvious to every 7-year-old. Think of the designer designing it. Presumably he'll have to have a picture in his mind of the whole thing, how it works, what it's supposed to do. That means in his mind is the whole complexity of the thing, plus more natural resources and how to do it, and energy, and who knows what else. So, if you're going to explain the existence of a complex thing on the grounds that there's a designer, you're going to be stuck with a designer who's at least as complex, maybe more complex. Then you'll have to repeat it again. Who designed the designer? Oh, well, then you're going to need an even more complex designer. So if you keep pushing this, you're going to end up with an infinite regress, and you end up nowhere. Therefore, he says, it's always wrong to explain complexity by appealing to a designer. Just a wrong move. I'm not going to spend the rest of the evening on all of what's wrong with that, though we could. But as a philosopher, this isn't biology. This isn't plate tectonics, what he's talking about. This is how explanations work, what explanations do, how they function. That's plain philosophy. Philosophers have been talking about that for thousands of years. So he stepped out of his expertise. Well, philosophers have answered him. I mean, they do so with a snicker, because it's so silly and childish. But they answer him as follows. Number one, you're really telling me that invoking design never works? It never works. It's never reasonable? So, if we're doing archaeology and we find cave paintings, which they tell you are 30,000 years old, beautiful, and they are beautiful. I don't know if you've seen them, and you can look at them on the internet. They are enchantingly beautiful. It's wrong to say they were painted by an intelligent designer. That's wrong. Because then you'll have to ask, who designed the designer? And to be back on an infinite. Of course it's not wrong. Of course they were painted by intelligent beings. Nothing but intelligent beings makes representative art of that kind. It wasn't dripping residues from rocks or acids that created pictures of those animals? It's ridiculous. Can't always be wrong. What about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? Started by Carl Sagan, that paradigm of atheism. You're looking for things in the universe that indicate there are other intelligent life forms. So, for example, you get coded the decimal expansion of pi to the first million places. Everybody agrees that if you found that coming in from a galaxy, that would be knockdown proof that there must be intelligent life in that galaxy. Nothing in the purely mechanical, physical world produces the decimal expansion of pi. But how? Why is that? You're telling me I have these radio waves coming in, these radios have a certain structure, and I'm inferring that they're produced by an intelligent designer. Is Dawkins telling me that I can't do that? That's wrong to do that? Everybody agrees that that's correct. So the idea that you can't describe, you can't explain complexity and organization by intelligent design is just dumb. Of course you can. Of course we do, and of course we should do. Will that leave over a question as to the identity of the designer and where he came from? Okay, it will. Okay. But so what? The first step in explaining where this came from is definitely the appropriate step. That's point number one. Point number two, you don't always, when you have a cause for something, you don't always ask for a cause for the cause. You don't always ask for an explanation of the explanation. You don't always do that. Classical theology is based on the following idea. There's a table in this room. I can ask, why is there a table in the room? Because I can tell you what the alternative is. The alternative is that there wouldn't be a table in the room. And that's perfectly possible. I know there are two possibilities, table in the room or no table in the room. And I want to know why one is right and the other one's wrong. When you ask, why is something the way it is, you are required to state another way in which it could have been. And then what you're saying at least is, why is it this way rather than that way? Suppose someone says, why is Q? And you ask him, why is Q? How else could it be? What other alternative are you imagining that it should be? And he says, oh, I don't know. I'm just asking, why is it Q? Then we have a right to respond. Then you're not asking a question. The why question is always what they call a contrastive question. It's why is this rather than that? If there isn't any other alternative, then why is it the way it is? Doesn't have any purchase. Doesn't have any content. Why is 2 plus 2 4? Well, what else would you have it be? 5? 3? 27? I mean, like, what are you offering as an alternative? If something is the way it is of necessity, then it is the way it is because of itself, not because of something else. It's only when you're asking why is Q, and somebody says, Q, and not what? Oh, why is it Q, not R? Oh, okay. It's Q and not R. Presumably there's something that made it that way. Didn't get that way all by itself. But if you ask why is Q, and the response is, but Q's got to be that way. There's no other way that it could be. Then there's no pressure to ask for what made it that way or why is it that way, because there's no other way it could be. Okay, now how does religion regard God? Does religion regard God as an accident? Does religion regard God as something which might have been and might not have been? They could, yes, be a God, or not be a God, and then say, well, okay, there is a God, but there might not have been a God, so what is it that made it that there is a God? Religion doesn't have that position. Religion's position is that God's existence is necessary. There isn't any alternative. So there's no pressure whatsoever to ask, where did God come from? Maimonides says this in the Guide, and everybody else before him and after him agrees to this. Now, maybe Dawkins doesn't like that. Maybe Dawkins doesn't like the idea that something's existence could be necessary. Then fight with that. Let's hear your arguments against that. But he doesn't do that. He simply says, if there is a designer, you're going to have to ask, who made the designer? Well, excuse me. According to the religious position, which he's fighting with, he's trying to show why religion is wrong. According to the religious position, when you come to God, there isn't any alternative. If there isn't any alternative, then the question why doesn't arise. That's the second problem in his argument. The third problem in his argument is this. He says that if you have a complex thing that exists and you invoke a designer to explain where it came from, the designer will have to be at least as complex as the thing that's designed. What kind of designers do you have in mind, Richard? Physical designers? Designers that are part of our physical universe that store information the way we store information, other things store information? Maybe you're right there, but that's not the way traditional religions think about God. Traditional religions think about God as ultimately simple. God doesn't have any structure, internal parts, organization. God is ultimately simple. And yes, complexity comes out of a source that's ultimately simple. Now maybe you don't like that. Maybe you think that it's somehow in principle, even including God, complex things can't come out of simple sources. Well then argue that. Argue that. Let's hear your arguments for that. But he doesn't present any arguments at all. This master argument that he presents is just the most obvious naivete when it comes to philosophy, and it's an argument in philosophy, and it is absolutely worthless. And so it goes. Are we together? Okay. Now, here's a kind of mixed case. The critic will say, you believe in free will? Yes, sir, I do. I definitely do. Well, the critic says, but look, you have a brain, right? Last time I checked, I did have a brain. And your brain is just a physical thing. It's just mutton under your skull. It's just meat. And meat is just a machine. Meat does what meat does. Because it's made of molecules, electricity, and so forth and so on. And it just does what it does. If you don't think a sheep has free will, well, you're just a very, very complicated sheep. And therefore, you don't have free will either. It's obvious that you are nothing but a physical machine. And if you don't believe that physical machines have free will, then you ought to admit that you don't have free will either. Okay. Now, the scientist is telling me this. What is his expertise? He can map the neurons in the brain. No, he can't, but let's say he could. And he can register their electrical activity, which he can't, but suppose he could. And he can do MRIs and all the rest, right? Fine. And he knows how the different parts of the brain interact with other parts of the brain. Good. I hear that. Right. Now he's saying, that's all you are. That's all you are. You are nothing but that. But you are claiming not only that this neuron triggers that neuron and these things have extra sugar and the electricity goes like that. You're claiming that's all there is. That's all there is. Somehow I think that goes beyond your particular expertise. Let's check. How much of what the brain does can you explain? How much can you explain in detail? How much can you explain even without detail? The answer is very little. I remember, because I'm ancient, I remember in the 60s when they were searching for memory in the brain. It was called In Search of the Engram. Where is memory stored in the brain? And in the 60s there were two major theories. One was that there are local storings, there are little patches for each memory, and the other was that the storing is done through some kind of global structure. And it was a global structure for everything, little pieces of but it's scattered throughout the brain for each memory. Those were the two theories. In 2012, Scientific American had a review article on the current state of brain research. Guess what? Both theories are still on the field. That's 60 years later, 55 years later. And they're diametric opposites. One says it's local coding, and the other says global coding. And they're both still in the field because nobody knows how memory works. Memory isn't math or learning new things or creativity or music or ethics. Memory is very basic. We just don't know how it works, that's all. Well, okay, so how much do they really understand? How much can you predict? Answer is zero. Can't predict anything. Even the physics of the brain. There are new surprises all the time. So how can you say we are nothing but brains, which are machines? How can you say that? How can you say that? Not only that, but I suppose if you are a working scientist and you're working with neurons, which are gigantic matters, if you go down to fundamental physics, you're going to say that it's all the product of what the atoms do. which is part of what the particles do, which is described by quantum mechanics. Do you have any clue what the quantum mechanical description of the brain is? Do you know whether there are some quantum computers in the brain? Whether there are sort of massive quantum states, not the quantum state of a single particle, but structures of particles which carry a single quantum? Do you know that? Do you know that it's not true? You haven't got a clue. So when you say we are nothing but the brain, number one, you don't know that that's true. Number two, you don't know what the brain is, and you don't know how the brain works. That's not part of your expertise. That's not part of your expertise. You're stepping beyond your expertise when you say something like that. That's where we can ask for reasons, and of course, you're not going to get them. Alvin Plantinga, who is a very religious Christian and a very fine philosopher, has written a number of books from which I have benefited tremendously. He wrote a book which was published by Oxford a year and a half ago, about religion and science, which is also very, very instructive, very wide-reaching. And he makes a very simple point. People want to say, if you believe in God, and particularly you believe in God, that a God that acts in the world, then you have to believe in a God that violates physical law. So if you believe in science, if you believe in the laws of nature, then religion is ruled out, because God's working within the world is ruled out by science. I'll give you an example. Physics believes in something called conservation laws. No, this has nothing to do with the humpback whale. Conservation works like this. You're going to do an experiment. Let's say you start by measuring the sum of mass energy that you've got in your system. You can do that. It's not difficult. Now you run it through. You compress them and fire them up and so forth and so on. And you keep track of everything. In the end, you measure the sum total of mass energy. Always exactly the same. So this has given rise to what's called the law of conservation of mass energy. Conservation means it's conserved. It always stays exactly the same. Now the thought is, if God acts in the universe as he causes a miracle, then the sum total of mass energy isn't going to stay the same. If he moves something around, he's adding more energy to the system. And science says that can't happen. Be violating the conservation of mass energy. Plantinga points out, and you can verify this yourself, go to any science textbook and look up propositions they call laws, and you will see that every one is prefaced by the following qualification. In a closed system, mass energy is conserved. Of course, if there's anything outside the system that affects the system, the mass energy isn't going to be conserved. Angular momentum. Angular momentum is conserved in a closed system. If something enters from outside the system, it's not going to be conserved in the system because something else is interacting with it. Every physical law stated for a closed system. Okay. Our position as believers in God and believers in miracles is the universe isn't a closed system. It isn't a closed system. So when we say God is outside the universe, cause and effect inside the universe, we're not violating those laws of nature that science proposes for us, because their laws say in closed systems things are conserved. We're just saying the universe is not a closed system. In order for there to be a conflict, science would have to say, and the universe is a closed system. But science doesn't say that. How could science say that? What could science offer as evidence for the idea that the universe, as we see it, is a closed system and nothing gets in from outside? What could they use for that? They haven't got any arguments for that. So it's simply not true that miracles violate the laws of science, the laws of nature, as taught by science. This is how it goes over and over and over again, where someone tries to set up the conflict, and it turns out that the conflict is based often on the scientist's naivete about what religion holds and how the two are related. And those are really philosophical questions or religious questions, and he's not trained to do that. You do have some scientists who are, I think, pretty good at understanding the philosophy of situations. One is Roger Penrose. And the other I'm now reading some more of his writings, Stephen Weinberg, who was, of course, an arch-atheist and anti-religious and the whole bit. But when he writes about science, the things that I have read have been pretty well informed. But it's very rare. It's very rare for a person to do that. And even a person who's reasonably well informed can make some terrible, terrible mistakes. Stephen Weinberg wrote a book called The First 3 Minutes. He wrote this in the 70s. It was a kind of popular science exposition of the Big Bang as it was understood in the 70s. And of course, the physics is first rate. He's a first rate scientist. But in the book, he made a remark for which he was fried over and over again. And he wasn't fried enough. He wasn't fried enough. He wasn't taken to task enough. What he said was, the more we learn about the universe, the more meaningless it seems. The more it has no point, it has no direction, it has no plan, it has no management, no God. The only thing that lifts the universe a little above the level of tragedy is the effort and the ability to understand how it works that we have put together over the centuries and millennia so we can understand something about how it works. That's the only thing that lifts it above the level of just pure tragedy. Meaningless, wasteful tragedy. And I thought to myself, man, oh man, Shevitz, how can you take your profession and push it to the limelight and say, the only thing meaningful in the whole of human life is physics? The fact that I'm a physicist saying it has no influence whatsoever, not relevant whatsoever to what I'm saying. My goodness gracious. Charity is meaningless. Justice is meaningless. Hope is meaningless. Why? Why would that be meaningless? Why would understanding particle physics be very meaningful, valuable, raising the world above tragedy, and other basic human values not be? There's absolutely no reason to take a position like that. There's no reasoning, thought, understanding in a position like that. It's just pushing yourself to the limelight. Just like Aristotle said, the function of man is to think, because that's the thing that man does best. So doing surgery is not the function, and building houses is not the function, and defending your country against attack is not the function. Only thinking is the function. And since philosophy are the highest thoughts, the highest human being is the philosopher who thinks the highest thoughts. And the fact that it's a philosopher talking is irrelevant. That is no non-prejudicial, right? Just the fact that he's making himself into the purpose of all human existence, just that has nothing to do with the accuracy of the quote. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But Aristotle said that 2,300 years ago. One might have thought people could learn from that and say, don't make the same mistake again. But Weinberg's remark is absolutely outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. But that's what happens when a person wanders into an area for which he has had no background, no reading, no training, no experience. Philosophy of science, he's really pretty good. So but this wasn't philosophy of science. This was the meaning of life and the meaning of existence. And that he just made a completely childish remark. And because he's a physicist, everybody took it seriously. Here's another thought. Democracy. Some people are disturbed about the fact that the Torah rejects democracy. What's the idea of democracy? People are misled as to what democracy is about. Democracy means, demo means the people, and krasi means power. Where is the power? The power is with the people. The people govern themselves. Okay, typically they govern themselves through proxies, but the power and the authoritative power, the rightful power, belongs to the people. That's why votes are taken to put the proxies in, and people can kick them out with another vote. That's how a rightful politics should be structured, because that's the only morally right way to do it. Torah has no truck with that. There's no idea that the rightful power, rightful authority belongs with the people. The rightful power and rightful authority belongs with God, period, not with the people. So people hear that and they think, wow, that's just unthinkable. It's unthinkable, indefensible, unsupportable. It's just beyond belief. Well, I don't know if this matters to people, but Aristotle said democracy is government by the worst. He was absolutely against democracy. Because, after all, who are the gifted, talented, intelligent, experienced experts in the population? Only a tiny minority. That's true in any subject. Sailboating, Chinese cuisine, how to climb 90-degree rock face. How many people are experts about that? A very, very tiny few. In any subject, the experts are a very, very small percentage of the entire population. 0.00001%. Very small. If you do it democratically, so then you're giving everybody an equal say, including people who have no clue as to what it is. So you say they elect experts. Yeah, sure. Maybe yes, maybe no. Then they're swayed by all sorts of political and social and psychological considerations. And you wouldn't treat any other serious subject this way. Let's suppose someone's proposing a new type of surgery for the hospital. Should introducing it or not be decided democratically? Have everybody in the hospital vote, including the cleaning staff, including the clerical staff, including the economist who runs the books in the hospital? Should he vote on the surgery? So he says, no, that's silly. Let doctors vote. Really? Skin doctors? Should they vote on the surgery? No, let other surgeons vote. Correct. Let surgeons vote. It's a matter of surgery. Let surgeons vote because they know the subject. Only when it comes to the administration of a country, you don't do that. Why not? Why not? There's something called an aristocracy, which means government by a kind of select class. The communists made this into what they called the meritocracy. These people should be selected for their merit, for their expertise, and let them make decisions. The reason why it's not done is because of the fear of tyranny. That's why. Yes, it's stupid. Yes, it's clumsy. Yes, it's contradictory. Yes, it's inefficient. Democracy is. But it'll protect you against tyranny. That is an argument. That's an argument. But it's not the argument that it's the best, that it's right, that it's most productive. It's just an argument that, like Churchill said, all forms of government are terrible. Democracy is a little less terrible than the other ones. So, all of a sudden, rejection of democracy becomes perhaps not such an idiotic thing. All that you're worried about is protecting against tyranny. That's the real thing that's worrying you. Nothing else really matters. Now, in Jewish terms, political terms, you have a very interesting structure of the authority in society. You have what in America is called division of powers. Division of powers is not part of democracy. It has nothing to do with democracy. Ancient Athens, where democracy was sort of introduced to the Western world, did not have division of powers. When there was a decision to be made, people got together and they made direct democratic decisions. The proposition was put in front of them and they voted. Whether it was war and peace, or whether it was new laws, or whether it was punishment, judicial, they just voted. Our democracies have decided democratically to split powers. That's a result of the decisions made in a democracy, not part of democracy. Ancient Israel had division of powers because the Sanhedrin was the supreme legislative power and judicial power. The king had independent power. He could raise taxes, he could do public works. He had his own independent input into war and peace. And the prophets had powers. Prophets had independent legal powers. So the prophet Nathan could come to King David on the throne and accuse him of a crime. And he was justified, and David confessed that he was right. David couldn't say, I'm king, who are you? You're just a citizen, you have no right to accuse me. Yes. In our structure you do it. So then, if you're worried about tyranny, if the rest of the laws are in place, maybe it's not so easy to have a tyranny. Because the king wants to do one thing, and the Sanhedrin says, I'm sorry, it's illegal. And the prophets come along and say, God told us to tell you that what you're doing is wrong. It's not so easy to have a tyranny. Under those conditions, the defense that everything must be democratic is going to be quite difficult. So again, the critic who's looking from the outside, if he doesn't understand how the Jewish system works, and he just takes it as an obvious axiom, if it's not democratic, it's wrong, he's not correct. Because of his ignorance of Judaism, he's not competent to conduct a critique of Judaism from the point of view of his politics. This is how it goes, yeah.
If we were to have the Jewish political system now without Nevuah and Mashiach, how would we do it? Let's say that people sort of decided, okay, let's sort of change the way the state of Israel works.
If we had a majority of religious people who
Yeah.
I have no idea. To tell you the truth, I have no idea, because we are looking forward to the restoration of prophecy and the restoration of the Sanhedrin. We're looking forward to a return to the old system. What you would do in the meantime as a system, I have no idea. But I doubt very much that it would be a matter of a democratic vote, because the people have no authority in this regard. I should say, just one footnote here. According to the Rambam, anyway, there is one element of democracy in Jewish law, and that is when a new law is proposed, the Sanhedrin does not have the power to make law. According to the Rambam, does not have the authority to make law. The Sanhedrin can propose a law, and if the people, majority of the people, put it into practice, then it becomes a law. If they don't put it into practice, it never becomes a law. So there you have direct participatory democracy, like Athens. Like Athens. Everybody votes with their feet. The Sanhedrin says, do X, and if the majority do it, it becomes a law. If they don't do it, it doesn't become a law. But that's only in creating new rabbinic legislation. If you're interpreting old legislation or applying old legislation, that's up to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is binding, and nobody else has any input into it. So there is that one element. I guess a fairly important element. You have to know that every rabbinic law, according to the Rambam, was ratified by the majority of the nation. It wasn't the tyrannical power of the Sanhedrin imposing itself on the rest of the nation. Had they tried to do that, it just wouldn't have worked. Indeed, the Gemara records certain laws which the Sanhedrin voted on in several different generations. And the Rambam says that's because in the prior generations, the people didn't accept it. So it didn't work, so they had to propose it again and again, until finally the people went along with them and put it into practice. Other than that, you don't have democratic features. So I doubt very much that you would have a democratic system. It would be much more like deciding on surgery in a hospital. We have a tradition. The tradition is what we have and understand from what God told us through prophecy, and that's how we're supposed to live. People who are experts in that tradition are the people who tell us how we're supposed to live. Yeah.
What examples are there of the laws that didn't become binding to the people?
I think it was the oil that belongs to a non-Jew, which they wanted to make a restriction on so as to be part of the set of laws that separate Jews from non-Jews. And that law was proposed, I think, 3 times until it was accepted. But this would include all the restrictions on Shabbos and restrictions on kashrus, all the extra restrictions that are rabbinic.
Chicken, milk.
That's right. All those things became laws because the majority of the Jewish people accepted them in practice. And then, in order to undo them, you need a Sanhedrin to undo them. At any rate, I'm just saying that here's another example of a standard critique which is based on the ignorance of the religious side of the picture. At any rate, the bottom line is, if you're talking about these open-ended issues, number one, ask whether the person raising the question has the right kind of expertise. Usually it requires dual expertise, so then before you draw any conclusions, before you are convinced by anything, try to find out what people with dual expertise would say. And, as I said at the beginning, don't get trapped into people telling you, well, how would you convince somebody? Refuse that challenge. Don't convince anybody. Nobody will listen to me. I don't care. Question is, do they have reasons? Do I have reasons? How do the reasons match up? If I have enough reasons to show that my position is a superior position, I don't care whether I can convince them or not. That's not my job. If they can't be convinced by reasons, then they need psychologists. They don't need me.